Hello, everyone. Welcome to the Yale Centre for British Art's online series, Artists in Conversation. I'm Sarah Victoria Turner, Director of the Mellon Centre for Studies in British Art in London, and I'm delighted to welcome the artist and my friend, Rana Begum, to the programme today. Before we begin, I've just got a few housekeeping notes. Please note that this programme will be recorded. Your camera and sound are muted and will remain so throughout the programme. We will be using the Q&A feature located on your navigation bar to gather your questions for Rana, and they will be answered at the end of the programme. But please feel free to submit them at any time during this conversation. If you'd like closed captioning, a live transcript is available by clicking the icon on your navigation bar. So let me just tell you a little bit about Rana before we begin our conversation. Rana was born in Bangladesh and later moved to Hertfordshire in England. Her work distills spatial and visual experience into ordered form. And through her refined language of minimalist abstraction, Rana blurs the boundaries between sculpture, painting, and architecture. Her visual language draws from the urban landscape and incorporates geometric patterns from traditional Islamic art and architecture. Light is fundamental to her process. Rana's work absorbs and reflects varied densities of light to produce an experience for the viewer that is both temporal and sensory, which we'll be talking about much more in this conversation. In 2012, Rana received the Jack Goldhill Award for Sculpture, and in 2017, she received the Abraj Group Art Prize. She's participated in both solo and group exhibitions worldwide, and her work is held in numerous private and public collections. She lives and works in London, where we're both based today and speaking to you from. Hi, Rana, and thank you so much for joining me today. It's the end of a very busy week for us here in London. It's been freeze week, or it is freeze week still, and thanks so much for taking the time, and I'm really delighted to be talking to you today.
Hi Sarah, thanks so much for having me. Yeah, it has been quite a intense week with freeze, and actually also I have my solo show on at the moment, so it's been quite intense.
Yeah, we're really immersed in the art world, aren't we? And I'm really looking forward. I think through this conversation, we're going to share some of that and think about where your practice has come from, where you are now as an artist. But we're going to start with this image here, which goes back just a few years.
Quite a few years. I think,
Studio
yeah, for
in
me,
art
this
school.
slide is actually it's quite important slide because it does kind of take me back, but also it's also a reminder of things that I'm still thinking about, and things that still kind of come up in my work and still trying to kind of address. And it's a photo of my studio when I was at Chelsea when I was doing my degree. And I think this was a time where I'd kind of figured out the direction I wanted to go. And there were some failures in those images where you can see I'm kind of experimenting with geometry, but also trying to include color. And I think there was a lot going on, and recognizing that I can't actually explore or understand everything at the same time. I need to kind of strip back and focus on certain things. So it's a really helpful image of kind of where I started and the thinking process. You can also see actually a couple of maquettes on the table. I was really I was desperate to make large scale work, but obviously the studios are small and I didn't have the money, I didn't have the space, and maquettes became a way for me to kind of think about scale as well. So there's lots going on in that slide. So for me, yeah, I don't have much of my kind of photos of my early kind of practice, but it's yeah.
It's really nice to see that kind of as well, that visual language forming. And I think as
Yeah,
you see through the kind of works that we're going to talk about in a bit more detail, you can really
yeah,
see some of that core and that idea of experimenting with shape and with form as kind of something that
yeah.
you keep returning to and you keep pushing.
Yeah. And I had a list which I can see is not up on the wall. There's a drawing up on the wall as well, but I had a list of things that I was interested in, and it was a really long list. And I think I realized that after my foundation course. So when I started my degree, I knew that um, I wouldn't, especially in the first year, I wouldn't be able to explore everything in one go or in one work or in one body of work. So the next slide kind of gives you an idea of how much I kind of stripped back. And it was really looking at light and form and the impact of light. That I think during that time, there's a lot of kind of discovering kind of the things that I was interested in, discovering kind of and connecting dots as well. So one of the things that I knew that I have to kind of take small steps and slow steps. And like, for instance, with this particular work, I was interested in kind of relief-like pieces where it really played with light, but also with geometry and also repetition. So there are layers and layers to be unraveled with each work. And as I remember, as I was working in this series of work, I realized that surface, depending on the kind of surface, whether it's kind of matte or gloss or textured surface, it all had an impact on the work. And the discovery at that moment was also where I, I struggled with, I'm dyslexic. So doing the research, kind of theoretical research, was going to be really difficult. So it had to be practical. It had to be something that I kind of do physically and understand the process and do the thinking physically as well. So that was kind of a really I think I had to kind of think about how I do it, and I had to kind of say that it was okay, that I couldn't read books and books and try and understand abstract or minimalism or constructivism. I had to physically make work to understand it, and that's been my approach since then. And I I think that's why, when you look at the breadth of my work, and you'll see how how it's connected, how the different strands appear. So the next slide shows the time. I think I spent about 3 years exploring just color. So I put aside light and form and repetition, and geometry, and I was just focused on color, but not in the most simplest way, not in where I'm mixing paint, because again, that first image, you'll see where a lot of the colors that I was using at the time was kind of very muddy, very dark, very kind of gloomy colors, because every time I tried to kind of mix paint, mix a color, it just wasn't working. So I wanted to kind of work with, I would say, kind of pure color. And as I was kind of looking around in the studio for materials to work with, I realized that I had a collection of adhesive tapes. And so every time, I love spending time in DIY stores. That's kind of one of my obsession.
Very
And
relaxed.
Yeah, yeah, my favorite calming places to be. So I realized I had a huge collection of adhesive tapes, which you can't see in this image, but it's just underneath these kind of strips of vinyl. And I thought, well, this is, I'm not making work to kind of sell. I'm not making work to kind of, to create finished products. It was just purely research. And as I was kind of doing this research, I realized my palette was quite limited. So I needed to kind of expand that palette. And that's why you can see that the next stage was kind of using vinyls. That gave me kind of wider variety of colors. But one of the things that I just absolutely loved, I mean, so a lot of people ask, is there a kind of is there a system to using color? But actually, for me, it's mostly instinctive. I love how even like the thinnest strip of color could change the experience of the work, the mood of the work. And that I found really fascinating and exciting. And so, yeah, I spent quite a few years just experimenting and trying. And then obviously, it was a bit of a struggle to survive as an artist. So then I spent a few years trying to find ways of keeping the adhesive down onto the surface. And I remember, getting a lot of interest, but I thought, well, I obviously I am concerned about how I make work and longevity. That's something that kind of enters your head. And so I was like thinking, well, I know that I can't sell any of the work unless I make sure that they're secure. So I spent quite a few years experimenting, and that took me down another direction. Like when I started using resin, that's a material that's kind of very glossy, reflective, which meant that, every time you looked at them, you could see the space that they were inhabiting. And that became part of the work. And that was really interesting for me because that made me think about the space, that made me think about the three-dimensional aspect of my work or lack of it, and how I could push my work further. And it felt like I needed to. So I did stop making these works. And yeah, so the next slide, which is a solo show that I had in London in 2016, which I feel really brought the two research together and shows the different strands in my work. Ziba Ardalan, who curated the exhibition, I felt, created a narrative, which I think a lot of people with abstract art look for, and a way into the work to understand.
Yeah.
I mean, I don't know about you, but I get asked a lot, what is your work about? But I think for me, it was really helpful. Actually, it helped resolve a lot of questions I had within myself about my work and the direction it was going. I mean, I think when you're working away in the studio, you can kind of be in this bubble and you can be quite isolated. And I mean, I talk to my team. I'm very fortunate that I'm I can have that dialogue. But I think you can, your vision can be quite narrow. And so you need, I like kind of pushing myself. I like how one work will throw up questions about something that needs to be resolved by another work. And so this show really helps kind of navigate that, that kind of.
As well, we talked about an exhibition. Of course, you've got this kind of dialogue between
Yeah.
the themselves, and then obviously the space in which the viewer inhabits. And it seems, I mean, I remember coming to this exhibition in 2016. I think it was the first time that I really encountered your work. And like you say, it's sort of like a bringing together of these years of experimentation from
Yeah.
art school. And again, working with this language, working both with the wall, but works that start to kind of come off the wall and they're on the floor.
Yeah.
They're really kind of interventions in the space of the viewer. And I remember that, I remember that feeling, that
Yeah.
that your works kind of present to the viewer.
Yeah.
These
I mean, I don't know. It's just really strange because I was like thinking about. I remember talking to Zeba and I was like, "Oh, are you sure?" Initially I was meant to do like a two-person show, and I thought, "Oh, thank God, the pressure's off a little bit." And obviously, we'd met when I was doing Dhaka Art Summit in 2014, and before that, I don't think a lot of people knew about my work, saw my work in bits and pieces here and there. So this is the first time where an audience was able to see a body of work. And like you were saying, it was the case for a lot of people to be introduced to my work. And yeah, I think on the ground floor, I remember even having one of those kind of early tape resin pieces. It was like the start of of the show. Yeah, and I think there was a lot. I felt really excited. I remember putting up the show and thinking, oh my God, there's just so much I still have to do. And I still feel like that. And I still, for me, this show is still kind of an anchor. This is a work in paper. And so the previous slide, if you go back, is, these works are made of kind of mild steel that has been painted. And the other slide was works on paper. And I remember making the works on paper, as a way of studies for form, study for color. But the more I worked on them, the more I got excited. They took me back to the beginning. I actually just made them with just white paper, and I loved the way the light was bouncing around. And then I thought, I can use them to also understand color. So slowly they became works in themselves. And that kind of tends to happen a lot, with the work. They'll start off as something that answers a question, but then they become something else, something that's,
love that. Yeah, that they become their own questions.
yeah, exactly. And this is a series that's kind of ongoing for me because I think there's still things I'm discovering, and I think they really have this kind of playful, but also quite kind of interesting play with light. Actually, my partner took a photo this morning when he got up really early, 6 in the morning. I have the first fold I had made in the flat, and the sunrise had just hit it. And it's such a, I feel like I'm always kind of, the work is always kind of fresh and new. And that's important to someone who I think has difficulty with focus and is dyslexic. All of those things, I realize how connected they are. And, so these body of work really allow the kind of the most change to happen within a day or, a year. And you
Yeah.
really can see the shift within the work.
I think that, and again, that sort of what you're saying about, about your partner getting up and seeing them differently with the sunrise, it reminds us of the temporality of light,
Yeah.
sunrise and sunset, and how that has its own physical quality, which has a big impact on the way that your work
Yeah.
looks, it's kind of, the way in which it's projecting its own light as shadow. And I think, again, how works are not static, that they're
Mm.
changing in relationship to space. And I think a lot of your work is kind of making that proposition that it's never
Yeah,
one thing. It depends where we're looking at it, who's viewing it, what time of day it is, that sort of
yeah.
that living, the way that space and works actually can live and breathe in their own way.
Yeah, I think you've hit the nail on the head there. I feel like, they have a life of their own when it kind of responds to a space, responds to the light. And I think they're the most activated when when they have some natural light. And I think that's the thing that with a lot of my work, I kind of crave for them to be situated where they have some natural light. And another word that you've used that is kind of, I feel quite close to, is the fact that they are kind of, you know, like temporal, even though the materials that I'm working with are really solid and they kind of exist and they'll last for years. That is something that over time I've kind of like invested time and effort into making them last. But there is something about, I'm always trying to capture these little moments of experience, and that's always impossible. Like, I don't know, I imagine even as a photographer it can be really frustrating, because you can never get that, even if you try and take a video or a photo. If I'm out with the kids, they really get wound up by me, because I'm wanting to take photo. I'll stop the car, or they'll scream at me because they'll be like, you need to keep your eyes on the road. So there are moments where, like, I still remember quite vividly, and the photos just do not do justice. And so I get those moments sometime with the work, it might not show. So they kind of sit there until, like, maybe, I don't know, one time that happens, that kind of connection happens with the light and the space that kind of is really magical. And it kind of sticks in your memory. Yeah. This is a series where it's an important series, and it's also kind of really explains how I work as well. So the bar works in the previous slides, that the white bar work, that I produce, there is where colors are interacting with each other, but it's really difficult to explain or show how that happens. So when light is kind of hitting one of the colors, it kind of bounces off and hits the opposite color, and then they tend to kind of, the reflection kind of mixes. And I've been for a few years been trying to kind of figure out a way to make that interaction more tangible and more kind of physical, if you like. And I thought, well, how can I do that? And that took a long time. And I thought the way I could start was, layering paint, finding something that would allow me to kind of work with layers. And I wasn't expecting this to happen. So this is kind of watered down acrylic paint where, I've applied kind of a thin layer on MDF and then waited for that to dry and then applied another color. And it was so exciting when that happened, because I was like, this is exactly what happens in the work. This is exactly, and this is much more, I guess, literal than the relief pieces. So I was very excited, and I thought, okay, so these became studies for me. And I've been kind of exploring kind of the intensity of colors and also the tonal aspect of colors as well. And so these studies have then become installation and physical works that you'll see later. Yeah.
I think we'll move on. And I think that we're building up this real idea of, like rhythm and repetition being so important to the kind of way in which you're thinking, and like we said, this return to kind of unfinished business, which then plays out in other works that you do. These kind of threads, and I think the title that you use for this exhibition at Parasol Unit, the space in between.
Right.
And
Yeah.
I love that there's not only physical space in between the works, but when we're looking, across your career now, just thinking about, even that space and that relationship from one work to another seems, it seems very tangible, actually. There's these
Yeah.
threads that are connecting these layers of making, materiality, thinking, research, and how that kind of maybe plays out in quite a different way if it's, you're using aluminium or you're using fishing nets, they're
Yeah.
very different materials, but actually there are threads that connect across the practice, which we're kind of sort of really building up here.
Yeah, I think you're right. There are layers that kind of one could unravel as they look further or get closer to the work. And a lot of the time, I mean, I get annoyed because sometimes people use illusion sometime to kind of describe my work, but I don't think that is kind of the right fit. I think for me, um, there's a visual kind of composition um, and the way color and geometry works. But as you get closer, the work kind of reveals, the process is revealed, the material is revealed, everything, so there is no kind of illusion about the work. And I think, when you initially look at the work, there's kind of visual play of color, form, and light that is happening. And yeah, I think a lot of my work, you know, is, those three elements kind of are consistent throughout, and it appears without even having to kind of consciously. I realized, could I get rid of one and just focus? And actually it doesn't work. It doesn't. The three work as a triangle, kind of 3 points that make a triangle, and it can't survive without the other. So it's yeah, it's a really important kind of it's an important part of the process for me. And I think just, accepting it and saying, okay, that is something that I will acknowledge and work with and see where that takes me.
Yeah.
So even like the next slide, that's another way of exploring color and what happens with those bar pieces. So this is another body of work that came up initially when I did my show with Christia Robert, and it was this show that's called Interaction of Color, and immediately I was really excited. I thought, oh God, I definitely want to do a huge installation. I want to do a massive kind of wall painting where it's looking at color, where it's, like back, going back a bit and looking at the bar pieces that I work with and how that color interaction happens. So you can see, if you like, I should have had those two images side by side, but like the previous one where, I took it where I was thinking about what happens when color overlaps one another. But on this in this occasion where I'm thinking about what happens when color sits next to each other and the kind of the vibration that happens. And then I've also started thinking about, what if I add another layer where, kind of some of the colors are transparent and you can see, what happens. So there's lots of kind of ways of exploring color interaction and color relationship. I put this in because this is kind of, taking this body of work to another level where I'm responding to a body of work. I I did a show a few years ago called Dappled Light, which was originally started at Mead Gallery and then toured to 3 other locations. And the last location was the Box in Plymouth. And during my solo show there, they also had a solo show of Joshua Reynolds, which was to celebrate, oh my God, I'm going to make a mistake. I can't remember. It was 300 years of Joshua Reynolds or something. And I always kind of, when I'm showing somewhere, you try and connect and respond to what is happening. And I was kind of intrigued, and I was like, I don't know much about Joshua Reynolds. And I've recently become an RA, well, not recently, in 2019. And I thought, it'd be interesting to kind of look at his work. And the more I looked at his work, the more interesting it got. And, the fact that he really played around with and experimented with pigment, and and really kind of, when you look at his work, they feel very gentle and soft, and there was something which I'd never approached in my work, and there was drama. The closer we got, I remember going back a few times, and once I went back with my colleague Ellie McGarry, who's also an artist, amazing painter, and she works with color, so we really connect, and I really rely on Ellie for really experimenting with color and her eyes. She's got really good eyes. So I remember going and looking at these paintings with her, and Box have a big collection of Joshua Reynolds' work, and the more we looked at it, the more we couldn't believe like how the layers that goes on the work, and you can see how aggressively sometimes he's like worked on the surface, and there'll be moments where this kind of intense red is used and wiped across the surface to get the cheeks, the glow of the cheeks or the lips. And I loved that the way the paintings told a story of the process, and there was drama. And I thought, this is something that I haven't really considered in my work, or consciously kind of thought about in my work. So these are a couple of paintings that I've done in response to Joshua Reynolds' work as part of the Dappled Light show.
I love that. Hearing you speak as well, just really thinking about Reynolds' own process. And,
Yeah.
in many ways, you and Reynolds are quite an unlikely pairing, but this is like, as you're speaking and we're looking at this, it's absolutely genius. It's amazing, because it's not just saying, here's a contemporary artist, let's use your work as a lens on the past, but you're saying,
Yeah.
look at the Reynolds, and that's a lens on your work actually as well.
Yeah.
You get this kind of more, I don't know, intimate conversation about, again, making, about the effects of color, about, like you're saying, the physicality of the process, and actually that is then this kind of intimate conversation between past and present, rather than one coming first and influencing the other, or the other
Yeah.
being used as a, I'm sure you get this quite a lot. Artists are kind of asked to kind of interpret the past and give us the answer,
Yeah.
but actually this
Well, I
becomes,
was I've never been able to do that actually. When I get asked to kind of respond to a brief, and when the brief is really it's so kind of narrative based, that's not usually how I work. I usually respond to a space, a physical space, to the architectural space and how it gets used, how the purpose of the function of the space. So it's those things for me are in the foreground. But I think for me, what was really interesting about this process is that I realized that I'm not an artist that likes working in isolation. I'm not an artist that resolves things in my head. Um, I I like these moments of kind of quiet, and I don't, get me wrong, but I think I'm someone that loves having conversation. I love having, conversations either about my work or someone else's work. And I think when you have dialogue, you get so much out of that conversation. And I don't know, your life and your thinking becomes much richer. So this process for me made me recognize and discover things about my work that I hadn't discovered. And I think, and so this is why it's open. It's not necessarily about saying, oh, okay, this is happening and I want to respond to that. It's not as literal as that. It was, I think, both Ellie and I, when we were thinking and talking, it was really kind of digging deep into his paintings. But I mean, we dug deep into his paintings in terms of each painting. We didn't look at the kind of the history or the narrative, because that's not what I was trying to kind of respond. I think I was kind of responding more to the artist himself. And I think when that connection happens, it's so exciting. I feel like, oh my God, like I get it, and I think understanding someone's work and getting I find that really, it's quite an incredible thrill, like I feel like, I'm not alone, like,
And I love that can happen across very different practices and
yeah.
different times as well. We're going to talk about some of your projects and the projects that really have intervened in space in quite kind of dramatic ways sometimes, and both the kind of urban landscape, but also the conversation with architecture and also museums, where you're commissioned to kind of make work that really kind of, I think, push at the limits of institutions and organizations. Some things we might talk about a bit more in detail. Other things we're just going to be able to give people who are joining us online a snapshot of. But we wanted to kind of really show a bit of a range. And again, we're just going to start with a work from 2016, Reflectors, which was made for King's Cross, a moment for those of you who know King's Cross will remember it changing quite rapidly in these years. Major urban development around the railway station and lots going on there. And I think for me, I mean, I love this photo as well of Reflectors. I think it kind of conveys some of the joy of encountering
Yeah.
work, particularly against the grey, the grey overcast light of London, and seeing those children kind of like there's a joyous freedom
Yeah.
in running through the urban landscape and on the big scale. And I remember for me, there was also this moment of like looking at this work and thinking, reflectors, like, bike reflectors, and seeing you kind of use, or material that inhabits the everyday. But then when it's on this scale, it kind of does something almost cosmic.
Yeah.
There's that relationship between our own world and then how sculpture, how art works, a kind of a portal to take us beyond our everyday. So can you tell us a bit more about this?
Yeah, I think for me, like that was another thing that kind of coming to terms with using ready-made materials. I realized that, and I guess it's another way of kind of, yeah, just how we work as artists. And I think, I don't know, I feel like I'm incredibly fortunate that I can work and have conversations and collaborate. And so I feel like I don't see why I should kind of limit myself. And this is a material that I discovered during my residency in Bangkok. And I remember in 2006. And then when I came back, I tried to kind of find this material, but could never find it in the same way without kind of all these screw holes and stuff. And I used it initially during my residency to kind of explore the perimeters of the geometry that I use, and to kind of push that and think about repetition. And so it's great when I had this opportunity to work at this scale, there was lots of things that I was thinking about. When you're working in public spaces, I think you have to take into consideration how it responds to a space, its surrounding, and how people use the space. And I remember as a child kind of going through, like getting the train in from, St Albans, King's Cross, and then going to my aunt's. And it was an area that had such diverse, audience going through. And, there'll be people that kind of pausing for a moment, there'll be people rushing past. And I wanted to kind of reflect on that. I also wanted something that was going to be tactile, something that people could touch. And that's something I think, that when it comes to public art, it's not always possible to do. And for me, it's another sensory kind of element to the work that I think it's important. Yeah.
That interaction is genuine.
Yeah.
And another kind of this is quite different, going from the sort of more, I
Yeah.
guess, hard
Another ready-made material, I'd say.
industrial to perhaps a more, again, a domestic, a basket that people use in their homes for bread, and particularly this work kind of referencing some of your memories of Bangladesh and your
Yeah.
family and your home life, and creating these kind of incredibly, I think cocoon is the word that comes to
Yeah.
mind when I think about the
Yeah.
and the physical experience of seeing these works. And
Well, as a child, I remember with my daddy making baskets and weaving, and I remember that being a really calming process, and actually, and being hands-on. And the other memory, the vivid memory I have, is obviously spending a lot of time outside and really soaking in the surrounding, the sun, like particularly the intensity of kind of very scorching sun, and also memory of reading the Quran, and all of those kind of sensory things coming together. And I remember when I was asked to do a proposal, I wanted to kind of think about those experiences and bring about a space that could allow you to kind of experience similar things. So the first one was of baskets, and there's a lot of things I discovered making that particular work in terms of how the material can create its own structure. So that's like really going down the architectural route, and actually having to think about structure, having to think about how a form, comes about in space, and how the material kind of determines those things. So this is if you go to the next slide, it shows you, it's a good example of where, the first time I did it, I didn't really realize how each basket kind of supports itself and creates a structure. So actually I didn't need as much structural support. So the other thing that was really exciting was that when I made the first one, was how important the exterior was. And so in this particular installation, I looked at more the exterior, and hence why it kind of went, where I kind of got it dyed darker. And then the third installation, which was at Kettle's Yard, which is in the next image, you'll see that went back to the natural, where I was able to kind of answer some of those questions and actually then think about the space that it inhabits. And this was a church at Kettle's Yard. And I love this kind of overlap of religion and creating spaces that are calm and spiritual and meditative. And that is something that's been kind of lingering in my work.
As I look at this now as well, it's almost like almost like an epidermal layer. There's like a skin kind of quality as you see that the basket surface flow. And again,
Yeah.
with your work, I'm
Yeah,
almost
they're quite organic, and that is something that I know I'm using that a lot in terms of coming to terms with, but it's quite difficult and especially because I'm so drawn to the hard edge geometry, the hard edge, kind of, and hence why, like, I love Louis Kahn and, Tadao Ando, architects that really are quite brutalist, um, yeah, so
I think it's always, isn't it? It's that relationship as well between the hard edges and the
yeah.
softer forms and lines as well, which there is.
Yeah, and I found actually over time that I think I just need to let go. I think when there is a need or I'm striving to let go and create or break that rhythm and allow something to happen naturally, I do tend to go down this route, kind of more organic. But there is still a trace of kind of geometry. This was actually in the parcel unit show as well. And the reason I've kind of had it this way after the basket was, when I came back to the studio after having done the basket installation in Bangladesh, I was like thinking about material, I was thinking about structure, I was thinking about color, and I was thinking about how something takes up the physical space, how it forces you to kind of move around. So this for me felt like a drawing in space. And, if you go to the next image, you can see how structural it is and the way it kind of, you know, and
Yeah,
so
and I
this
think
is,
seeing the basket work just now as
yeah,
well, and then this work, you start to again see
yeah.
geometries map on to one another.
Yeah, and so, and this, I was really excited with this body of work, how, colors appear and disappear, or form appear and disappear. And there's something about that that is, again, it exists in my work. And I'm still kind of playing with and exploring. Yeah.
So we'll just talk briefly about these because Ryan and I were saying we can just talk to each other so
I
much.
know, I realize actually.
Into six already for us in the
Yeah.
UK. It's amazing. So we'll touch on some of these quite briefly, just again to give
Yeah,
people.
this was another response to a building. So it's a beautiful building in Bangladesh where, again, I was doing Dhaka Art Summits at the second round. And again, you can see how the work kind of progresses and changes. And I think, and I'm able to kind of articulate it now, but I think all these different experiences we have, it has an impact on us. It comes through our work. And this was in response to a moment where my father, when he'd left some land that he donated, and all our siblings had to kind of go back to Bangladesh and sign the paperwork, but it wasn't enough. We had to go to the registry office and put our thumbprint. And when we walked into the registry office, the both rooms were covered in fingerprints that people had kind of wiped there. And I just had this wonderful connection with, kind of architecture, land, and body, those kind of three things that I think, when we think about how sculpture inhabits a space, you are thinking about those things. This is kind of on a two-dimensional level, and I just found it incredibly moving. And so this is an ongoing series of work that I still respond and explore depending on the different situation. Yeah.
And again, we thought this, we're trying to, make some of those gestures where we know we're both in London, but we're doing this conversation under the aegis of the Yale Centre for British Art, and where, again, the architectural relationship to light through Louis Kahn's building is really important. And it's something, again, that kind of physicality of light entering a space
Yeah.
is something you explore over again. And we thought the Phoenix Will Rise work is really speaks particularly to that relationship between kind of concrete and then your forms as well, and color.
Yeah, and also actually collaboration. So this is one of my collaboration with an architect, and Marina Tabassum, and I absolutely love her work. And she's designed this beautiful mosque. I think it's one of my favorite building other than Parliament House in Bangladesh. in the world, and it's just so mesmerizing where light is used almost like the bricks in the building. And so I mean, I was nervous having conversation with Marina. Obviously, she's huge and just absolutely adore her and in awe of her. So I was just so chuffed to be collaborating and having conversation. And when you're thinking about the title, it's there's lot of kind of discussion and a lot of back and forth. But I think collaborations are so enriching and so rewarding. And they still kind of they build relationships, and this is one of the projects that we worked on, which then toured to concrete in Dubai, and the first one was indoors and the second one was outdoors. So I think maybe we can just, and that's another collaboration with a fashion designer, Roxanda, so you can just flick through
Kind of
those.
we're giving this is
Yeah.
like the
I
taste.
know these are some of the other works where it's like this is in John Snow, so responding to architecture. So I love it when this is the same work and you can see how different it is, and I think it's so important for me the work adapts to architecture. This is currently at Pallant House, on a stairwell, double height space, and I love it when it's really working with architecture rather than clashing or fighting with a space. It's really responding and being organic and
Yeah, and
moving
again, I
with the
love how your
space.
work is like, it asks us to look differently at spaces that sometimes we know
Yeah,
well, or, even for me, like, I'm not sure I've really looked at the balustrade very carefully at Pallant
yeah,
House in a beautiful Georgian townhouse building. And again, how
yeah,
forms make us really look at that formal construction of
yeah.
our physical world. And even, even just like looking at
Yeah, and it really gives you a different perspective of the work, so there are moments where you're quite far from the work, there are moments where you're very close to the work, so you really are forced to kind of see the work in different kind of viewpoints. This is kind of relates to the painting series where the color interaction is happening, where it becomes sculptural, it comes out of the two-dimensional into the physical space, and using material like glass. This is another work where it's responding to space. It was done during the pandemic. And actually it was really interesting because I was thinking about creating spaces where people can move out the way to let someone pass. So these kind of offshoots of geometry accommodates that moment in time, but also creates, and when I finally went to visit, a year and a half later, I was so grateful that actually it lines up with these incredible views that you have of the sculpture park as well. So that was a big fluke, how that worked.
We know lots of people are joining us from the US. So Rana's work is represented in quite a few US collections. And again, the interaction, that collaboration that you have with space and institutions, which we can see here in these images as well.
Yeah, so that was the initial piece at Parasol Unit, and then it's just whenever I get an opportunity to kind of develop that series, I take up that, yeah. And then the next one, this was Palm Springs Desert X. Absolutely loved working on this, even though we had to work on it remotely. I loved using this material that I've been thinking about for years and creating something that was architectural and interactive that really forced the viewer to kind of navigate through the space and really think about the material and what it means, in terms of barriers. So again, ready-made material. So that is a theme that kind of comes up in my work in subtle ways. It's political, but subtle political work.
I guess that, of the everyday, and like here we can see people,
Yeah.
touching their.
Yeah, it was really interesting because people, coming up to me and going, "Oh, I'd never never realized about, what you could do with this material, but also never really looked at the material in this way before and how beautiful it is. And that's the other thing, is that there is something, most of these materials have a function and a purpose. And we don't really think about the aesthetic side of it and how beautiful they can be, or how they respond to light or space. This is a current commission that's just gone up at Boston Fine Arts. So if anyone's out there that are on this webinar, if you are near there, please go and visit. I'm very excited by this. So you can see in the next slides, I didn't know whether it's going to work or not, but I love the way the light kind of floods into the space, different time of the day, and how it still allows you to have a connection with the outside and the inside of this work. This is a recent one that's just finished in Verbier up in the mountains. So if you're there at all, please go and visit. There's a beautiful image. I don't think we'll have time for that, but you can move on to the next slide, which I love how I was really intimidated by the landscape. It is breathtaking, absolutely
Monumental.
breathtaking. And I thought, there is no way I can compete with this. And I was like, why do I have to even create anything? And then I knew, having spent a lot of time, I knew I wanted to respond to this landscape where the work wasn't fighting. It was something that was, it's the word that you've used earlier, temporal, something that was kind of ephemeral, something that had moments where it really responded to the different seasons as well. So the color I chose, I went during spring, and that's when you can see, it's just so beautiful and bright, some of the plants and the flowers that are coming out. And I was just drawn to the colors of the landscape, as well as the kind of wanting something that was kind of quite calm and quite contemplative, but also felt like it existed, but it could disappear, and allow you to kind of experience the landscape as well. So I love that ephemeral quality of the work.
Yeah, and this image in particular, right, for me as well, in your work, the sculptural or installation works, there is this play between the intimate. So here it might be the individual kind of rectangular grids that make up the bigger piece of mesh, and then the epic. So there's that, that play of scale, which can be both like you focus on the minute, the detail, and then it does something that opens you up into the grand, the epic, the monumental, and that play is really, for me, very present.
And I think someone had, I think it was Zeba Ardalan that had said to me that a lot of my work has this kind of dual experience. So there is moments where it's kind of really bold, vivid, and quite loud and quite active, and then all you need to do is move, and you get to this kind of calm, quite contemplative side of the work. And I love that. I love when that happens, and I think it means that you really can find moments with the work.
Yeah, I think this is, and we've just put in some images that this is your work live space, and again, I know for people joining online, and thanks so much, Rana, for sharing this, because there's a kind of intimacy to this, opening up your studio, your life, and we're just sort of sharing some of this like space of where these ideas are kind of tested, experimented with. You can see here you've got your plan draws, you're working with your team who are kind of helping you kind of manufacture some of these kind of amazing
so this was designed by an architect called Peter Cully. The firm is Spatial Affairs, and he was actually based in LA. So don't ask why I went all the way there, but he used to work for Rick Mather, so he had experience, working in museums and how to kind of work with light. And it was a really important part of the brief, which, you know, having natural light in the space. And he spent a lot of, I mean, I don't know. I mean, I have a lot of respect for Peter in the way that he worked. And it was really fascinating when I look back now, how he spent a lot of time observing. I just thought it was a bit strange at the time, but he spent a lot of time observing how I work, observing how I work with the team or how I am with my kids. So it's a live workspace, and the studio is on the ground floor and basement. And he, you know, in my old studio, I didn't have any windows. And then when I moved, I didn't have any windows either. And there seemed to be a pattern. And so I was constantly opening the front door to see, or to bring in light to see how the work will. And that was something he noticed. But the location where the studio is, you know, I've got 13 party walls and only one neighbor that is, you know, it's a cemetery, and everyone is very nice and polite. And but the rest of the neighbors, it was impossible to work with and difficult to have any windows. So we had a huge challenge, and Peter did an amazing job where, you know, like he's created a space where it can grow, adapt to my needs, to my children's need, to my team's need. And actually, you know, it's just, I love the way it flows.
Yeah,
I love
I
the
mean, we
way
can
the
do a
light
little.
comes
We
in.
will do a plug here that Rana and I had a conversation with a collaborator of mine, Joe Baring, for our podcast, Sculpting Lives, where we talked a lot as well about the juggle of motherhood, of
Oh my gosh, yes.
parenting, and living and
I
working
remember that.
pressures. So if anyone wants to kind of explore these ideas more, you can listen to
Yeah,
that conversation.
actually, Sarah and Joe had caught me at a time where I was dealing with being a parent. So that is entertaining if anyone wanted to.
Yeah, there's lots going on, wasn't there? We're coming out of a
Yeah, there was,
pandemic.
yeah.
Yeah. And then we just thought we'd end with your current show, which is on at Kate McGarry at the moment. And again, sort of really a lot of these ideas about materiality and light, I think both the quiet and the monumental come through in these works. So just for us to conclude before we open up to a few questions, do you want to just talk us through these Louvre works that you have made?
Yeah, so this is a video, so you can press play. And for me, this is a body of work that I've been working on, actually two body of work in the show that I've been working on, I'd say, for about 10 years. It's been an ongoing part of my research where I have been thinking about repetition, thinking about rhythm, thinking about color, thinking about light. And I found that I was like taking a lot of photograph of windows, blinds, louvers, vents, and they, you know, they kind of hold this place for me where they feel quite kind of monolithic, but also a detail of architecture that kind of um, breathing, somehow moving, somehow alive, somehow shows a connection to change. And I think even when you're looking at, I'm sure you're going to look at vents differently now after looking at this body of work, but I've always kind of found myself staring at these kind of weird detail of buildings, or you know, surface of you know, of a facade, or and I think it's just the way they capture light, is the way they kind of play with light, the way they change, and how do you then kind of move. So in this body of work, I'm exploring lots of different materials. It was an opportunity where I could see how light kind of plays with color and glass and stone and metal, and how they kind of play and interact. So there's lots of different things in this show that's come together. And this is a drawing, you know, a series of drawing that I did, or I started in Bermuda when I was doing my residency. And this is when I recognize, like, you know, in Bermuda, a lot of the building have these kind of stepped lime roof, and so they collect rainwater for day-to-day use. And the roof is just so beautiful when you look at how it plays with the sunlight. And I started doing these watercolors in response to kind of those the roofs. So there's a lot of kind of, I guess this body of work really relates to architecture quite closely, and different part of architecture. Yeah.
Fantastic. Well, thank you so much, Rana. There's so yeah, you've kind of given us so much. It's been like such a generous presentation, and I think I always think your practice is a really one of generosity. We've talked a lot about collaboration, about the conversation between space and light, and form. And I think as well, hopefully through the works that we've chosen, we've really helped people kind of look carefully at both the detail, but also that interaction with space. And I think you really make us look at the world in quite a different way. So thank you for sharing that with us. I'm just going to see if we have any questions on line, just to bring the people who are with us, and thank you so much to participants for joining us. And I'm just having a quick look down the list, and quite a few actually. There's a theme about whether you've got advice that you would share with emerging artists. It's a tough one, but I guess what would be the thing that
I think it's just recognizing where your passion and drive lies, as an artist, and actually any profession. My partner's a structural engineer, and he's obsessive. He can't stop talking about his work and thinking about his work. So I have friends that are musicians. So I think when you live and breathe something that you love doing, and Sarah, I can imagine you're the same. You can't help but be looking and thinking about art. So I think if you're passionate and are excited and love the idea of making and producing, then I think that's where you would start, and you'd use that as a direction. So yeah, I think, and also you've got to ask yourself constantly questions, because you're always going to be doubting yourself. That's another thing that I think as part of being an artist, you're always doubting yourself, but you just continue.
Yeah, and I think learning to sometimes turn the noise down on those doubts, sometimes listen to them and use it as kind of to propel you forward. It's a difficult path to negotiate. And I think as well, I know that you've had this, that people who are really, it's like finding the people who do support you and kind of champion you and lift you up. I think that as well.
Yeah, I think I love it more where I get really constructive feedback back, but sometimes I don't. Like Tess Giray, who's an artist that's been like my mentor and who I absolutely love and adore, and she's quite brutal, and she'd be like, "What are you doing, Rana? Like, what is going on here?" And that is enough. Sometimes I won't even get a chance to explain. I was like, no, but I was trying to go this direction. She's like, no, it just doesn't work. I don't and there'll be moments where she'd be like intrigued and will ask questions, and and that's when it's really exciting. So yeah, I have done that, and it's quite harsh. But I love it. I think it's so helpful to have people around you that can have the confidence to do that.
Critical friendship, I think is the phrase. A comment here that's really nice from Gillian Forrester. Thank you so much, Rana and Sarah, for such a compelling conversation. The breadth of the work is remarkable and so much to meditate on. But Gillian says, as a parochial British art historian, parochial, I know Gillian very well. Parochial's not the word I would use at all.
Yeah.
She said that she found your comments regarding Reynolds' process extremely illuminating and loved the works that you made in response to his portraits. She didn't see the box show and would not have automatically connected Rana and Reynolds. So I'm really pleased that
Yeah.
this kind of, which I love. I think we too often pigeonhole art history in periods, and actually thinking it through process or themes, I think just enables us think differently and creatively about practice and process, which is not confined by the barriers of time or by history, or we can use that in a different way. So that's
But I think in response to that as well, I think one of the things that I was saying earlier, how we can be you know, like you can just have this quite narrow vision. And I think for me, I found that it's so important to have an open mind. It's so important to have dialogue. And I think in this current world with everything that's going on, we need to be much more communicative and much more empathetic and understanding. And I think for me, I'm always, I think I love hearing what other people, the views that they have of the world, the views that they have of the work. I think these are really important. And I think this is why I found, like, it is very, Gillian's right. It's not a pairing that I would have, wanted. And actually, I know, I don't know if Priyesh is on there, but my recent obsession is obviously Turner, because that is, I can't believe I didn't have that connection before, but I did a talk at the National Gallery, and that just really, for me, I was just so excited by that connection. So having that connection with Joshua Reynolds through understanding his process was really wonderful. And I think as artists, we have to stay open-minded, and not just as artists, as human beings. I think we need to stay open-minded. We need to allow things to happen, allow conversations to happen. So thank you for that, Gillian. I really appreciate that.
Well, I think remaining open-minded and
Yeah.
ending on with Turner, for especially in the context of Yale Centre for British Art, who I know are doing lots of work as they're thinking, my colleagues there are thinking about next year and the 250th anniversary, and also the reopening of the Yale Centre for British Art to the public. That feels like a really nice moment to leave it there on, yeah, open-mindedness and critical conversations we need to have with kind of the past, the present, and the future. So thank you again so much, Rana. I've
Thanks
loved
so much
talking
for
to
having
you.
me. And
It's
thank you
been,
everyone for coming on a Friday night as well.
yeah.
Well,
So
it's Friday evening here.
Friday evening and Friday lunchtime in the US. So thanks so much for joining us. Bye.
Bye. Bye.